Um, First thing is pursuant to the State Ethics Act, I want to remind all members of the committee of your duty to avoid conflicts of interest as set out in the subchapter. That's NCGS 138A-15. I also want to ask if at this time there are any known conflicts of interest with respect to any matters coming before the committee this morning. Seeing none, we will move to approval of the draft minutes from the January 10th, 2024 Water Allocation Committee meeting. Does anyone have any corrections for the minutes? Okay, seeing none, do I have a motion to approve the minutes as submitted? Thank you, Commissioner Duggan. And a second? Thank you, Commissioner Deerhake. All right, the minutes are approved. Oh, all in favor? Okay, thank you. Opposed? Okay, we're going to move to our first information item. And I believe we're going to have David, is David Lambert here? Yes, hi.
Oh, yeah. Each presentation. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me here today. My name is David Lambert. I am the Director of Intergovernmental Affairs and Economic Development here at DEQ. Oh, yes, absolutely. Sorry, I'm sorry.
Getting a few technical glitches resolved.
No, sorry about that. No, that's completely fine. So my role here at DEQ is a new one with Secretary Bowser. In light of some of the economic development that's happened here in North Carolina, we know that we really needed to have some coordination between the Department of Commerce, Economic Development Partnership of North Carolina, because these are some real rapid, transformative projects that we're seeing here in North Carolina from an economic development perspective, from a housing perspective. All these things require a really great coordination, and that's what really my role is meant to do. We are having, and part of this is also looking at regionalization and working with the municipalities and making sure that we understand how we can prepare for this growth, how we can address these needs. And that's a lot of what we're doing here today. But it's no secret to most of you, I'm sure, that North Carolina was named #1 state to do business 2 years in a row. And here in my role and in my camp here at DEQ, we talk about, healthy environment and a healthy economy go hand in hand. And that is 100% true. And we need to make sure that we can have a state where people can make a good living and it remains livable, right? And so that's some of the questions and some of the thoughts that we are going forward today. Now, in your agenda or in your packet, you should have my presentation. Way more than I'm really going to be able to cover today. So I'm going to trust that maybe you all can read that. And if there's any questions, I'm happy to convey, have conversations with you offline or any of that. But I want to go kind of over some of the main points here. So this is kind of really the who, what, when, where, how of this presentation. And in Session Law 2023-134, Section 1216B, because of the foresight of the governor, the secretary, this administration, and the General Assembly, we really wanted to make sure that we were able to be prepared for this rapid transformative growth in the Upper Cape Fear region. And part of this requires us to have a really good idea of what's possible. There are some impairments in the stream. There are emerging contaminants. There are lots of allocation questions in this region about what's possible. And so rather than having a Band-Aid for infrastructure projects, I mean, just incredible investment in infrastructure and jobs in North Carolina, but is there a plan? Are we investing in the future of this region in a sustainable way, or are we just, funding something to make a project happen to get the jobs for that direct investment. But what about the houses that will come? What about the indirect jobs? What about the induced jobs and the other businesses that will come as a result? Are we preparing adequately for that? So that's what we want to be proactive. And part of our role is we want to be proactive and solve problems before they become problems. Or in this case, we want to highlight that there's some big problems out there that if we are proactive and then we can work together to solve this, we can do so in a better, more efficient way. And that we can also do that in a way where we have a lot more options now. Because I truly believe as we look at this, that there will come a time where we will have to start thinking about regionalization out of necessity. Whereas now we can think about regionalization as an opportunity. And if we do that now rather than later, we can keep saying yes to economic development. We can keep saying yes to a lot of these really transformative projects that we're doing because we're able to do so in an effective and responsible way. So this is the session law. And this is the 7-county region that was identified. It's basically Guilford, Randolph, Chatham, Lee, Southern Wake, Harnett, and Johnston County. And you can also see where I've highlighted there are some of the state's largest recent economic development projects. And you can see Toyota, VinFast, Wolfspeed, Amgen, Fujifilm, Novo Nordisk. And the project, this study is what I believe to be the most comprehensive, largest regionalization study in North Carolina's history that I'm aware of. And no one's corrected me yet. So that's what we're working with. And it is quite a feat. If the budget, the budget was passed a little later than July, and it was certified a little later than that. So we really hit the ground running in December with a May 1st deadline for having this completed. And we are working with rapid pace to do an effective, efficient presentation for everyone. And who's doing that? We're working with our DEQ team, the folks here in this room, who are helping us with this project. And then we also are teaming up with private sector. We've got Hazen and Sawyer, Freese Nichols, Withers, all of these sort of folks who are also helping us with this. And they are already engineers in these regions, in these municipalities. So they have some expertise. They have firsthand on the ground knowledge of some of the things and challenges in this area. But that's exactly in the weight of this economic development, it really highlighted some of the challenges that we have in infrastructure, some of the challenges that we have environmentally that will have to be overcome and addressed in a proactive way. We talked a little bit about the why, and this is why I probably won't spend a lot of time here because I've been doing that as we speak. But the idea is that DEQ has $6 billion running through DEQ at this point for infrastructure and investment over the last few years with ARPA funding, investment from the General Assembly and the Governor's Office. All of these options are coming through us right now, and we want to make sure, are we just doing a quick fix for these projects, or are we doing a strategic plan or strategic investment? And so some of the significant challenges that I do want to talk about is there are impairments, of course, within the Upper Cape Fear region with phosphorus and nitrogen. That does limit some of the loading that these municipalities or that these plants can take or can discharge. There's several small underfunded utilities in the area. Larger utilities have trying to take up that mantle, take over some of that responsibility, but it's difficult for them to meet the demand of their own areas, much less go elsewhere. There's compliance and other environmental issues, moratoriums in the area, emerging contaminants, of course, and their impact downstream, and older treatment processes that can limit the ability of some of these municipalities have older treatment processes that may limit the effectiveness of treatment or the thoroughness of treatment that, if they were able to be improved and have better treatment, you might have more capacity that could be allocated. You might be able to do that in a more responsible way. Some things we talk about, why pursue this regional approach? Well, we know that one person's water upstream will come wastewater, and then that will go water, and that will become the next person's water. So we have this cycle here, and it's important that we address this. And this approach that we have here in North Carolina, and in just background, I'm a former town manager. I've worked in the solid waste field after that for Moore County. I've wrestled with some of these questions myself and working with other areas about how do we secure water and wastewater. And this every town for itself approach is not sustainable. Economic development does not exist or does not confine to just municipal or county borders. We've got to think broader because the effect and impacts of those choices environmentally and economically go beyond those borders. And so these are some of the things that we are talking about is how can we have a long-term strategy and have some of these solutions. So I want to zoom in on one example here. And that's Siler City, Chatham Advanced Manufacturing. This is just kind of an example of what's happening in this region. And this is the home of, the future home of Wolfspeed. And it's located in western Chatham County, right next to the Randolph County line. Siler City has a moratorium for wastewater. They've had significant challenges and not a lot of revenue to fix a lot of issues in the past. And in order to land this deal, they needed water, and they're bringing in 55 million from Asheboro. Was given to Asheboro to bring a water line to the site to supplement the water that already exists in Siler City. And the good news is that Randolph County was prepared. They're looking to form an Eastern Randolph Water District and consolidate and work with some different partners to branch out water. But there is no real long-term wastewater solution in Eastern Randolph County, which we'll circle back to. And then this year, that was in the 2022 budget, and in 2023 budget, there was 75 million for wastewater improvements to go to Siler City. And that was contingent upon Sanford operating that plant. So there was kind of a string attached that Sanford needed to come in here and manage that. And so this includes a wastewater plant expansion and go from 4 million gallons to 6 million gallons. And quite frankly, if you ask Wolfspeed, Siler City's having 6 million gallons a day is not enough. They want more, they need more. And their suppliers and their industries that want to come in there will make it happen, want to make it happen. But there are significant challenges, as we've discussed. And one example would be, a neighboring Ramsewer. Ramsewer, for example, there's been some studies and some engineers have put out that potentially, perhaps, they could yield a flow of 7 million gallons to be discharged in that area. Well, because of the impairments in the stream, because of the limits in technology, being able to reach that capacity is very unlikely. In fact, they're at 500,000 gallons a day approximately. I'm going from memory on this one. But they could probably go to 1.7 million gallons with the limits of technology. That's a huge gap in capacity. And keep in mind, DEQ, we're a delegated program of EPA when it comes to a lot of this, NPDES permitting and some of the nutrient loading. We've got to understand that we can't just write a permit, right? We can't just make it happen. We've got our own checks and balances. And, right now, these impairments in the streams and being able to hold that is very, very important. So there's some of the things that we're looking at here, and that's some of the challenges that are presented. So when we're looking at this study, and I want to make sure I'm respectful of time, I'm probably going to take maybe 5 more minutes. But some of the things that we're talking about here is we want to make sure that we are data-driven, that when we work with a team, practically achievable. And number one of the most important to me is creative. What we don't want and what we don't need, quite frankly, is another study that we can sit on the shelf and say it's very well done. It needs to be practically achievable. We need to understand, and part of that is engaging with the partners and understanding what they need, the municipalities, and also creative. There are certain solutions or proposals that could happen here that no town in their right mind, in a world where every town is for themselves, would ever ask for, would ever plan for, because a $500 million solution for one town and one county is really not a viable option for many of these small towns. But that could be a great option for an opportunity for a 7-county region. And so we see this study that we're looking at right now that was required of us and by the General Assembly and others to be a first step in building the strategy. Secondary studies are certainly going to be necessary to operationalize some of these recommendations, but I also want to make it clear that this is not an ultimatum for these municipalities. We're not coming down and saying this is what you must do, but we need buy-in. We need to have these conversations, and we need to understand there's a cost of not doing something as well. There's a cost, and there's when we working together as a town and municipalities and counties, it's hard. There's a lot of history, there's a lot of background, there's a lot of things that go into that, but there's a cost of not doing it, and it's going to cost even more if we wait. So there's just some things to think about. We're talking about in the study, impairments in the stream, nutrient loading capacity, impact of the announced indirect jobs, mitigating impact of emerging contaminants, identify options for, regionalization can mean different things. It can be interconnections. It can be consolidations. It can be bigger, larger treatment plants and taking all other ones offline. It can mean a lot of different things. So what's going to work in each community? We all want to increase sustainability and utilize best practices for environmental justice. And what the team is going to come up with is at least 3 regional strategies. We don't predict this to be a one-size-fits-all, one regional strategy for this whole 7-county region. but perhaps 3 different ones where there could be a coordination of activities. And also, if we can, rough order of magnitude of cost for some of these strategies, we know that that can change with just, one investor, one investment. Potential policy changes, environmental justice analyses. So if there's a way that we can get access to people for clean drinking water by running a line here instead of here, we want to be able to analyze that as well. So those are some things that we are doing and looking at. I just want to give one example, going back to Wolf Speed in the Cape Fear. You can see the map here, right? The campsite is that green image blob on the right-hand side of the screen. You can see it's right next to Randolph County. And you see Ramseur just to the left of that. That is the town that I mentioned earlier. They're sandwiched right between that Toyota mega site and that campsite. You've got Liberty there as well, sandwiched right between it. Liberty has a spray field, limited capacities. There's lots of options there, and their growth that's going to happen there is going to be, important to wrestle with. And so in this study that we're looking at, we get Wolf Speed, perhaps 1,800 jobs, and we've worked with Commerce to get some numbers on, direct jobs that would be new residents that would be in this 7-county region as a result of Wolf Speed coming there. Then additional indirect jobs, perhaps the suppliers that would come, that's 1,000. And then induced jobs from a just regular part of commerce and industry that would come along with that. That 1,800 jobs turns into 2,866 jobs really quickly. And that's just for one mega site project in the area, not including Toyota, not including VinFast, Amgen, any of these entities. So part of what we're wrestling with in this study is how many new homes will this require? Where will those new homes go? What types of businesses will serve Wolf Speed? That's important for us from a perspective of understanding the industrial waste. If there's going to be a lot of semiconductors, if there's going to be a lot of different types of industries, they will have very particular waste characteristics. And we need to make sure that if they're going to be located in this area, the wastewater treatment plants can handle it. And there are some places that in this area, that if some of these places were to go, they would not, if they wanted to go to a particular spot, they can't say yes everywhere. There are some real issues here. So those are some things that we want to talk about and that we're doing. This is a broad overview. We expect the report to go to the General Assembly as required on May 1st. And so I don't have answers of what the study has revealed at this point. And I say that, it's not that I don't have them to give, I just don't have them. They don't exist. And so we will have that available to you and happy to have further conversations as well. I don't know if you guys usually do questions or not, but thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Lambert. And I think we'll take some time for a couple of questions. We do have 2 more presentations this morning, but thank you very much for introducing us. Do any of the committee members have questions for Mr. Lambert this morning? Yes, Commissioner Smith.
So one question about funding. My understanding is a lot of the funding is federal pass-through money from a couple of different pieces of federal legislation. And a lot of those federal programs that pass through to the state for water and wastewater have some limitations on use of that funding in terms of, it tends to be geared toward meeting environmental standards, maintaining or replacing existing infrastructure, as opposed to addressing growth. And that's been a real challenge in the past. So are there significant gaps between the demand for funding and the allowable uses of the funding that's coming through the federal programs to these local governments?
Well, you are correct in that there's certainly different pots of funding that have different requirements. And in many cases, 2 things can be true. There can be environmental issues present and growth present. For some of those programs like CDBG, when you're applying for that, you're not going to talk about that economic development aspect. You're going to talk about some of the environmental or other aspects of the project of how you meet that demands. But there certainly are right now a lot of state appropriation dollars even coming through DEQ that are not tied to, that are not necessarily tied to just one type of environmental issue. There's certainly also, and there's economic development dollars as well. So there's tons of all this out there going through Commerce, going through DEQ, going through other entities. But yes, I would say that we can always use some more funding. And because it's necessary, we've got aging infrastructure out there. And what we need, and part of what this goal is to do, is with the regionalization grant funding that we have and all these opportunities, we want to be able to do a strategic plan, something that will build something that will be sustainable, not just these ad hoc situations.
Yes, Commissioner Deerhead.
A couple of questions, but thank you for the presentation. Why were these counties chosen? How did these counties get selected, and why are some others excluded?
That's a great point. I do want to highlight a couple of things. Part of it, the General Assembly gave us this legislation, and a lot of it also is that these are the concentration in the Upper Cape Fear region. This is where we're seeing a lot of issues and we're seeing a lot of growth. And you're seeing a lot of businesses come to this area, and part of that reason is we have tremendous access to workforce in this area. You have a lot of universities, a lot of homes, a lot of folks. And so it's a natural choice for some economic development on some of these large sites. So that's part of the reasons why the industries that are coming here and these transformative large mega site projects are in this region. And our approach to this was we know there's an issue here and it's impacted by the Cape Fear region. But if, for example, and I'm going to go back a little bit to this map, we're focusing on, as required by the general statute, on these solutions, the solutions in these highlighted areas. However, if there is an adjoining county that could offer value and that could offer solutions for the highlighted area, we are not ignoring that. I said, we're not going to stick our hand in the sand and just focus just on the possibilities and options that are just within these counties. We are asked to solve a problem in these counties. The other counties are there to help and be a part of that solution as well. And I can think of Alamance County, for example, right there. They have a lot of water that may be able to be an option. And you start talking about, I don't want to go too far into that, but there's different river basins, IBTs, different questions that can come into all of those type of questions. And the question is, if you may not need an IBT if you can send wastewater back up too, right? So water down, wastewater up. There's a lot of questions around that, but we are not ignoring the presence and the needs of other areas, but we are focused on what we were requested and mandated to do in the General Assembly statute.
So with the substantial increase in employment and residents in the area, I would encourage you to look a little broader. Davidson, Montgomery, Moore, Alamance, as you say, because of commuting distance and the secondary impact on the surrounding counties and their demands on their systems increasing.
My hope is that in this session or in future sessions that we can expand this study to other regions and other avenues to make sure that we can find solutions across the state.
And my second quick question is about Ramseur.
Yes.
Do they discharge into the deep?
I think so. Let me double check. They do discharge into the deep.
And so the deep is deep, but what is the water quality of the deep? I mean, we've looked at Siler City in the past for, I guess, water supply and basin discharges, I guess, going probably more toward the Jordan side of Siler City. But are we comfortable with the water quality in the deep and that basin?
Well, no one's ever accused me of being a scientist. I want to be very clear about that. So there's certainly some folks here who probably answer that a little bit better. But from my perspective of what I'm working here is that there are certainly some serious issues that we want to make sure that we preserve and that we want to make sure that we protect those areas. And that's why, we have impairments, phosphorus and nitrogen in that area. We have worked with Siler City, which is right there next to Ramseur, all those type of areas that have issues there. And we know that everything upstream in Guilford-Randolph County will flow down to other areas. So it's very, very important that we are proactive and protective of that. But we want to improve water quality everywhere. And there are some challenges in this region, which goes back to your first question of why this region, why now?
Commissioner McDonald Gibson.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the nice presentation. I'm wondering how the existing utilities in the region, particularly maybe some of the smaller ones, are reacting to the idea of regionalization. Is there resistance or are people on board with it? What's your sense of that?
We have had some engagement with the locals, local municipalities. And I know I've spoken to Randolph County in particular. I spoke to Guilford County at their commissioners meeting last Thursday. Part of this also is our engineering firm team that is associated with this are already working with these individuals as well. Met with Southern Wake County as well. We have, a lot of these folks have questions. They realize, and I've come from a small town perspective of less than 1,000 people when I was a manager there. There's concerns about if I give up control, if I give up this power to perhaps entice people to be annexed in by giving them water and sewer, I might lose general fund revenue. There's all these questions that come into, and sometimes, sometimes communities don't like other communities. Sometimes for whatever reason, there's history. So that's going to be the hard part, right? People working together, but there are several different ways that we want to identify as, do we consolidate? Do we just interconnect? Do we have an authority with an appropriate governing structure so everyone has the appropriate equitable amount of say in what happens in the authority? Do we give it up? One challenge I think is associated with this is I can look back again on my own experience that if Moore County were to take over Robbins' wastewater system and water system, which quite frankly needed to happen from an economic development or from an economic perspective and from an environmental perspective and expertise, we would be in a situation where we would have to raise taxes to cover because those public works employees are also cleaning the streets. They're doing the water main breaks, the water breaks, they're digging the ditches, they're doing all of those things. And I think we had $6,000 for every penny of taxes. And so you need to have 3 or 4 people on that team to do that. That's a lot of money to raise in taxes that were originally being divided between general fund, water fund, wastewater fund, that now have to be reconciled. So there's a lot of questions there that go beyond just the questions of environmental. There's economics, there's town, there's politics, there's all these sort of things that are going to be involved in it. And that's why this is the first start of a conversation. I think once we can see what's possible based on some of these big factors and find ways and show that this can demonstrate how this can be effective, I think then we can have some of those tough conversations. And DEQ is certainly welcome to be a part. We want to be a part of those conversations, but some of that would be engaging people taking charge on a local level and seeing it to make it happen.
Well, thank you again, Mr. Lambert. Oh, I'm sorry.
I think one of my concerns to share Commissioner Deerhake's concern is when you do project by project, you miss the big picture. And to your point on the deep, things like watershed protection, land conservation, it gets overlooked in the individual projects and the big picture doesn't get to. I didn't see any of that in your slides about individual projects and not looking at things holistically or the secondary and cumulative impacts, whether we want to call them that in environmental documents or not. There's the same effect to support what you're saying. We need to do more on the deep if it's going to take more stress, and those individual projects won't get us there. So I would expect DEQ to be advocating for a more regional environmental approach, not just to cobbling projects together. Most of this money has to be spent by 2027. These regionalization agreements they take 5 or 6 years to do. So the timing's off too here. So
if I may, we wanted to make, I'm sorry,
Go ahead.
We don't want to go project by project. That's what this is the point, is that we want to zoom out. Because this approach of just looking at Wolf Speed and looking that we need $55 million for this water line and 75 to meet the capacity needs, that's not going to work. That's every town for itself. We've got to zoom out and we've got to be able to look at the whole watershed. And that's what we want to, that is the system that you described is what we are experiencing now. And that's what we want to zoom out and to address exactly what you're talking about. The funding aspects of this, funding has not been considered for a regionalization project. That's yet to be determined by the General Assembly and the governor's office and some of those coordinations. What exists right now is you have mentioned that the ARPA funds is going to be spent by 2026, 2027. That is not necessarily part of this. If we would have had this before then, I think that would have been a really great situation. But we are here now, and we know that we need to move forward. There are other funding associated with this, with direct funding by the General Assembly and the state of North Carolina, $4 billion or so of that is not tied to a deadline. And so we are not dictating what people's projects, what they submit, but we are 100% on board in agreement with you in that we need to zoom out. We need to look at the whole area. This project by project approach leads to a Band-Aid solution when we're having a heart attack. That sounds really grave, but we really want to make sure that we've got big issues and we don't want to do it piecemeal. So I agree. And there was a part here that perhaps the individualized approaches will take longer than a systematic approach. And I didn't quite go over that specific line. I'm looking for that on here. But if we do the same thing in a lot of different areas with varying degrees of results and without coordination, it's going to take a long time to see those results. A regional approach will allow us to do something on a broad level to see sweeping results more quickly and more cost effectively and efficiently and hopefully more effectively.
Did you have any follow-up, Chair Solomon?
No, I'm not gonna say anything. I'm good.
Okay,
There's a
all
lot
right.
of discussion about this, but
Yes.
there's a lot of projects going on before we would get regionalized.
100%.
All right, well, thank you again. Next on the information items, we have Harold Brady. He's going to give us an update on the IBT world.
While David's setting this up, I'm Harold Brady from the Water Supply Development and IBT Coordinator with the Water Supply Planning Branch, DWR. IBTs are, well, it's a great segue from David's presentation to this, talking regionalization. Interbasin transfers or IBTs are, it's kind of hot right now. It's getting hot. It's likely to get hotter in the next year plus. So I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. This is an update. I presented last session on just a primer overall of what the IBT process is. So this doesn't really get into that. This is really getting into the nitty gritty of IBT. So we've got two interbasin transfers that have been requested. One I'm going to spend the most time on today is the Charlotte Water interbasin transfer. They sent a notification for request, a notice of intent is what we call it, to the EMC on February 22nd. So I put this together rather quickly from that notice. But we have been talking to Charlotte prior to receiving that notice. So we're going to quickly go through what the proposed transfer is, a map to give you an idea of what we're talking about. The process for modification is a streamlined process. It's a little different, truncated process than what a full-blown new interbasin transfer would be. And some odds and ends, including scheduled public meetings. And then for the second part of it, just an update on where the town of Fuquay Arena is with their IBT request. And that is a full new IBT, not a modification. Okay, so what we're talking about here for Charlotte Water, right now the source basin is the Catawba. They pull water out of Lake Norman and Mountain Island Lake, and then they discharge it. They have a you'll see in a map, they have a slew of wastewater plants, but they have two that they discharge to the Rocky. And right now their certificate from 2002 sets a limit of 33 million gallons a day on a max day basis. They are projecting at this point, looking out 30 years at a 63 MGD on a max day basis. So that's an additional 30 MGD max day. The statute right now the statute has changed since it was issued in 2002. We now look at it as the statistic we use is average day max month. So we'll have to convert that 63 to an average day max month. And I will also impress the point that in my time doing interbasin transfers, I've never had the number that comes in with the NOI to be the number that comes out after the EIS. And that's often different than the number that comes out when the final determination is made. So use this as a rough guide, but expect this number will change, particularly when they go into the environmental document and start doing much more focused, detailed look at what the projections will be.
This is why you steered me to the.
So here's a quick map of what I'm talking about. You have a couple of intakes. On the left-hand side of the screen, Lake Norman, Mountain Island Lake. You can see on the right-hand side of the county, that line, that's the dividing line between the Catawba and the Rocky interbasin transfer basins. Rocky is obviously in the Yadkin major basin. So they have a significant service area in Mecklenburg County that they provide water and sewer to. There's consumptive loss in that, meaning that's water that goes on the ground that isn't collected by the wastewater system. And then they have 2 discharge points, the Mallard Creek Water Reclamation Facility and the Rocky River regional system that that's controlled by Cabarrus County, but they sell wastewater to there as well. Any questions on this map before I move on?
Yeah, let me ask you, just so I understand this, what would happen, or I guess this is really predicated on where their current wastewater treatment plants are located, because if they were piping it all the way back across to the Catawba, it would be substantially farther and more expensive. Is that what this is really all about?
Well, most of their wastewater collection system is geared towards, it's designed to move that water towards those plants right there. So if they were to then, they would have to probably pipe it from those wastewater systems directly back. So that would be as opposed to reworking the entire wastewater collection system. And you can see down at the bottom of that area, that moves water back to the Catawba, that gray area down the bottom right of the county. So it's that blue area is where the consumptive is in the receiving basin. All right. Quickly go through what the truncated modification process is. It's subsection V in the statute. So the first step, this NOI, by the statute, there aren't any required public meetings to be held. So here's where I want to be clear here. With Charlotte Water, there is a settlement agreement that was established back in, I think it was 2010, when they finally came to the settlement agreement. The parties in the settlement agreement for the first IBT were North Carolina, South Carolina, Charlotte Water, and Duke Energy. Duke because they control they own the reservoirs that they pull the water from. The settlement agreement, which I've got a copy if anybody wants to look through it, it requires that there are public meetings and there is notice to folks upstream and downstream in both states in the source basin. So I'm working with Charlotte right now to determine how best to move forward with those public meetings, what the process should be in light of the settlement agreement, as the IBT statute with this modification doesn't really provide us a lot of detail, though it does provide us with what the normal process is. So the second part of this will be an environmental document. Here's where the public meeting occurs for the project and a modification process. Once the environmental document goes out to the clearinghouse, then we'll have a public hearing at that time so that the public has an opportunity to review that document and then come and speak on it. Once again, the statute requires an EA, but the settlement agreement requires an environmental impact statement on this project. So they will be doing a full-blown environmental impact statement on this because of that settlement agreement. And then you see the rest of the process. The department issues that FONSI, or in this case, a ROD, record of decision. Third step, a petition is not required for this modification process. So it's the EMC will take that environmental impact statement, will come up with a final determination and, well, a draft determination, and then do a final determination on that and vote on it. So it is a more truncated process.
If I could ask you, yeah, I just want to understand a little bit better. You mentioned it's a truncated process. What has changed from the old process here?
So in the first step in that NOI, there would be 3 public meetings involved with that are applicant-led. And then in the third process, there's a petition document, and then there's multiple public meetings public hearings, I should say, associated with that. There's a large draft determination process that goes along with that petition before the EMC finally is able to reach that final determination.
Okay.
So it's a little bit more public engagement, and then the petition document as well.
One of the challenges when we first did the modification or looked at it legislatively was if you had an IBT already and you want to make a minor modification or make a minor request, you should have an easier time to do it because you've been through the big process theoretically 10 or 20 years before. I don't know that it anticipated doubling of the request as an expedited thing, but that's how the statutes have been modified, I think, twice now to make that modification easier if you're an IBT holder. But this is a pretty big modification.
Or at least in theory, make it easier.
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
The EMC has a lot of flexibility here by the statute, in that the EMC is allowed to, if there are issues that you see, you can impose, have more public hearings. You can impose additional information provided throughout this process. So I don't want to make sure, I want to make sure you know you're not necessarily hemmed in super tight. You do have flexibility with this.
Mr. Chair, may I
Oh,
ask-
yes.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Are you
Commissioner
getting
Darrow.
ready to move on to the next one?
I was, but if you have a question,
Okay.
or I was going to move on to the next slide, but if you have a question.
Well, if the next slide is about the Fuquay Marina, I would like to ask a question about Charlotte.
Please ask.
The discharge is going into the Rocky River Basin, and we've been hearing through the Yadkin River Basin Plan about a year or two ago when we reviewed and approved that renewal of that plan, that the Rocky is already having impairments, but emerging even more substantial impairments are on the way. So how will this increase of 30 million gallons a day discharge into the Rocky River impact the existing impairments? And are those existing impairments in part attributed to the previous IBT?
There are a number of wastewater facilities in the Rocky Basin. I know you're aware of it. So through this process, this environmental impact statement, those are the questions they will need to be addressing, is how their proposed project will impact the Rocky. And I recognize that there is a cumulative issue in the Rocky.
So I would think as they work on the impact statement and as the department reviews it, they would expect to see, in defining the baseline as it is right now, the existing baseline versus maybe before the original IBT,
Okay.
do some source attribution analysis to
Okay.
look at how that contributes to the current impairments and the projected impairments.
Thank you for letting me jot down a note there. But no, thank you. It is important. So thank you. Any other questions from?
How long of a process are we talking
The only other modification that has gone through, and I worked on that, was the Carry Apex mod that went, I think it started around, I'm just trying to go back and recall, around 2010, and it ended around 2014. So, yeah, years. So we're talking, that one took about 4 years. There was litigation. And so the litigation, I think, actually took it out to about 2016, if I remember right. So 6 years with litigation.
I was just gonna, to make the comment that the settlement agreement that's been referred to earlier came out of litigation with South Carolina that went all the way to the United States Supreme Court. So, and this is a much larger increase in the IBT than was at issue in the previous litigation. So the interstate issues are going to complicate this one tremendously.
The applicant has reached out to South Carolina with DHEC and has had early communications with them from what I'm being told. So there is some coordination going on right now with that, but your point's well taken. So just to sort of touch on some points, it's to modify the O2 IBT certificate. I will note that their projections from the O2 IBT certificate were remarkably on point. And so they're coming to us 8 years before they were necessarily projecting the end of when the 30-year projection for their IBTs would come. And they've actually, it's hitting pretty close to on the nose for what they projected for 30 years. So this isn't, at least for me, this isn't coming out of the blue. I've been sort of expecting Charlotte to come to us for a little bit now.
Mr. Brady, I think Commissioner Duggan had a question.
I'm sorry, I was just going to ask, is there a way to get a copy of that settlement agreement?
Absolutely. I'll get you a copy of it right after this.
Great.
I'll give you my copy and get it to you.
Thank you.
Okay, so the projected demands are coming from residential, commercial, and a little bit of industrial growth. You've got the Mallard Creek area that's right there and kind of in the center of that blue area where they're seeing significant growth, significant residential growth in that area. It's even outpacing the Charlotte metro area. There are plans for public meetings. I'm calling them scoping meetings. For early May. So there is a chance, a good likelihood that the meetings will occur before this committee meets again in May. So that's why one of the reasons why I want to impress that point here. This is an important step in their process. Any more questions on Charlotte? Okay. Hope real quick, Fuquay Varina. They've requested in their NOI, they're moving water, they're proposing to move water from the Cape Fear to the News Basin. In their NOI, they mentioned 4. In the initial draft EIS, they're looking at more of 6 MGD. This is what I was saying before about Charlotte. Expect those numbers to change. In this case, they went up. This is average day over a max month. They have resubmitted the revised initial draft environmental impact statement that the department is internally reviewing. And once the internal review is done, then we'll distribute it for a wider review to agencies as well as the public and public hearings and such. I think that's it.
Thank you, Mr. Brady. And we do have another information item coming, so we might need to have you back if folks have more questions. And just a comment for the committee and for especially people who are new to IBTs, whether you're dealing with an original new IBT request or a modification request, I think it's been made apparent through Mr. Brady's comments that it's a complex process, and there are a lot of moving parts, legal and technical issues and challenges that come up. So we'll be relying on the department and Mr. Brady to keep us informed of the status of these of both of these IBTs and any that come forward. And the last thing I wanted to say, I'm pleased to hear your sense that Charlotte is making overtures to South Carolina. I was concerned when I didn't see any of anyone in South Carolina copied on the letter that Charlotte Water sent to Chair Solomon and the commission. So that's new information for me, and I'm encouraged by it. Thank you again. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody, for your time.
And next, we have a presentation by Dr. DeVries. On the Central Coastal Plain.
Hi, thanks for having me today. My name is Dr. Stephanie DeVries, and I was asked to present to you on the Central Coastal Plain Capacity Use Area. So we are, I'm sure you're familiar, a water withdrawal permitting program to sustainably manage North Carolina's coastal plain aquifers. I'm going to kind of glide through some of the early slides. I'm a teacher by training, so I like the geology and I kind of dwell on it a little bit, so forgive me on that. But I know that we're a little bit short on time, so let's see if I can make this work here. There we go. This intro slide was just to sort of illustrate the broad geology of North Carolina. We're focused on the coastal plain, which is the eastern third of the state, which is also the youngest. The short version of this is that over the last billion or so years, we had rocks accumulating up to about the point of the fall line, which is that little orange line up at the top of the screen. We also know that better today as the I-95 corridor, that which lies directly above that fall line. When that also marks the coastline of North Carolina at around 200 to 180 million years ago, when the continents were all combined into a single supercontinent, Pangaea. When that split apart, the Atlantic Ocean basin started to grow, and that basin began to fill with sediment from those weathering Blue Ridge Mountains and the Piedmont. And so that sediment sort of filled in from bottom to top and made this big wedge of material that is comprised of sand, gravel, clay, and some interlayered limestone beds as that became a shallower sea over time. And so this is a tremendous groundwater resource. About up to 40% of that is occupied by water that fills up all those tiny little spaces between the sand grains and the pores and the limestone. And so this has been well developed, but not all of the aquifers are the same. So this is a little cross section you may have seen before that illustrates the sort of geologic layers of the aquifer materials as you go from Raleigh, which is point A on that cross section, towards Oriental, North Carolina, near Pamlico Sound, which is point B, and we kind of pass through Cove City, New Bern, Kinston, along the path there. And so what this represents is the layers of unconsolidated material as they developed. The oldest are at the bottom, the youngest are at the top. And as these were deposited, the shorelines started to migrate to the westward, or I'm sorry, east. I always get confused where I am in North Carolina. I'm sorry. And they started moving to the east. And so what that means is the footprint of individual aquifers is not necessarily equivalent. So when we start at the fall line and we start dumping sediment into that newly forming basin, most of that coastal plain then is occupied by that early sediment, which is composed of the lower Cape Fear and upper Cape Fear sediments. As we move forward in time, the coastline is getting pushed out. You see that the Black Creek, which is the center footprint on the right side of that screen, is the edge of that where it begins is pushed eastward, and it's more or less not present in the northern part of that coastal plain. And then by the time we get to the Oligocene, which is when the Castle Hayne, which is that tertiary aquifer up towards the top, by that time, the coastline was all the way to Kinston. And so the Castle Hayne, which is very thick and highly productive because it's mostly transmissive limestone, is only available in that sort of third like wedge of the state over there. So this is important in terms of planning your water resources, because obviously you can only use water that's there in an aquifer that is there. But I also want to point out that there are water quality issues that can vary between these individual aquifers. So because they're separated by thick layers of clay, they don't really communicate with one another in a vertical sense. So if you look at the Black Cape Fear, it's got a big wedge of clay illustrated by red there. And so that prevents water from the overlying aquifer and the underlying aquifers from actually exchanging. And so like each has its own sort of chemical signature. And you see that that green line represents chloride, which is salt water from the Atlantic that has, some of it was deposited with the sediments themselves, and some is kind of, you know, an existing saltwater wedge. But over time, fresh water is flushing that out, but it does so at different rates depending on the age and transmissibility of the material. So if you were, for example, to go to Cove City or just somewhere between Cove City and New Bern and try to drill a well, how deep you drill it is going to be very important to whether you're getting fresh water or salty water, because you're going to cross that line. So with that in mind, if we look at groundwater use in the coastal plain aquifers, I put up two figures here. The left is 2002 data and the right is 2023. And because the Castle Hayne is so very thick and productive, it has been the most widely developed. And the majority, you can see that in 2002 and 2023. Behind that are the Upper Cape Fear, the Black Creek, and the surficial aquifers. And there's some changes that you see between 2022 and 2023, predominantly an increasing reliance in the Castle Hayne and a decreasing reliance in both the Black Creek and the Upper Cape Fear. And what this reflects is the onset of the CCP-CUA permitting program around that time frame. So a little bit of history about the program, why it came to be. Takes us back to 1959 when the Texas Sulphur Gulf Company was mining phosphate in the Beaufort region. The mines were right on top of the Castle Hayne aquifer, which quickly filled with water. It's a very pressurized aquifer. You can see that in the upper right photo. And so they started dewatering. And by 1963 or 65, they were pulling out somewhere in the ballpark of 60 million gallons of water per day, which is not insignificant. And the result of that is you take that water level, which is more or less a gently sloping line, and you create this big cone of depression at the center of that pumping, which is the figure you see on the lower right. And the impacts of this can be broad. In this case, it affected people as far out as 50 miles from the center of that cone of depression. So you can see the aerial extent on the left. And some of the wells would have experienced lower productivity. So if your water level drops relative to the position of your screen, it reduces productivity of your well. If the water level drops below your screen, you no longer have water. Or if you're in the coastal region, you can also see saltwater encroachment. So as you lower the head in the coastal region, then saltwater wedge can kind of force its way in and start to impact your wells. So this was the large expanse of this drawdown was the impetus for the 1967 Water Use Act, which established the capacity use area number 1, shown in green on the right here. And this encompassed all or part of 8 counties that were impacted by this drawdown in the Castle Hayne aquifer. And more or less what this did is it established a permitting program and a set of rules to better manage or more effectively manage withdrawals in the Castle Hayne in that region to prevent the adverse impacts that some of these users were experiencing. But one of the things it didn't do is we weren't really looking at withdrawals that were happening in other parts of the coastal plain aquifer, including the Black Creek, which this is a drawdown map that I produced from data in 1997 to 2002 on the left, and then I generated a cross-section of this from 2002 data. And what this illustrates is that there's a large drawdown in the Black Creek that is outside of that capacity use area. It's to the south and to the west. And of particular interest is the 2 areas that I have highlighted in red on the plot on the right. So this is a cross-section of the water levels relative to the top of the aquifer, moving from the north to the south from A to A prime. And on the leftmost box, what I've highlighted here is a region where pumping water levels are bringing the water level of below the top of the aquifer physically. And when this happens, it depressurizes the aquifer skeleton. In other words, those pore spaces that are being held up in part by the pore pressure inside the aquifer itself goes away, which can allow the overlying weight to collapse the aquifer itself. And this is a permanent degradation of the quality of the aquifer and will impact its productivity permanently. There's no coming back from that. So this is bad. So for this reason, we labeled this the dewatering zone and an area of immediate concern. To farther south on this line, closer to the shore, we see what we call the transition zone. This is where we're starting to see the impacts of encroaching salt water. The leftmost boundary of the zone is where you can drill a shallow well and still get fresh water, but if you get towards the bottom of the aquifer, eventually you're going to hit salty water, which we define as 250 ppm chloride. To the southern end of that cross section and the right side of that boundary that I've drawn, you would encounter salt water at the top of the aquifer. So that's sort of the farthest extent of where you could access fresh water. We see similar trends in the upper Cape Fear. Again, we have a large cone of depression has developed outside of that CUA #1 region. And here we're not seeing as much, we did not see dewatering as much, but we did see declining water levels. So here the pumping water levels are sort of hugging the top of that aquifer. So it's alarming, but not yet at the point of no return, and something that we need to monitor. And again, we have a saltwater encroachment zone here. So both of these, you can see by the maps, like these are regionally expansive drawdowns that could have long-term adverse impacts on the aquifer and regional water users. So this led to the adoption of the expanded capacity use area, which in 2002 replaced CUA #1. So we call this the Central Coastal Plain Capacity Use Area, and it now includes 15 counties, including all but 2 of the original. Hyde and Tyrell are no longer part of the capacity use area. And this took a few years, a few bumps along the road, but the end result was basically a permitting and registration program designed to most effectively monitor and manage groundwater in the coastal plain to ensure the long-term productivity of this aquifer. The permitting program, in a summary, if you withdraw more than 100,000 gallons per day, you're permitted and you're going to report data to us. If you withdraw between 10,000 and 100,000, you're registered and you're going to report your data to us. But the bigger part of this, and this goes back to some of the previous conversations or talks you've heard today about regionalization, was an effort to reduce withdrawals, especially in the most vulnerable parts of this aquifer, to protect them and other water users from those like long-term adverse impacts. So with that in mind, we designated 3 reduction zones as part of the expanded CCPCUA rules. These are the dewatering zone, which is shown here in red, the declining water level zone in yellow, and the saltwater encroachment zone, which is shown in blue. So this kind of occupies the central swath of the capacity use area, and we have, I think 58 users that are mapped in here who are either registered or permitted to withdraw from these regions. And at the onset of the rules, when they were established in 2002, these users were subjected to a proposed schedule of reductions in order to mitigate the impacts of dewatering and declining water level zones and encroachment. So those reductions were up to 75% relative to what they were already using. So this is we've got a bunch of figures here that we're going to kind of work our way around. The upper left shows the proposed reduction schedule. It starts in 1997. The reason for that is because the reduced withdrawals were based largely on what users were withdrawing at that time. So either calendar year 1997 or between August 1999 and July 2000, whichever one of those annual withdrawals was greatest, that's where we set the starting point for all of our users in this region. And then the rules set forth that by 2008, they would reduce their withdrawals by 25% in those higher risk zones and 10% in the declining water level zones. Another reduction, same value, 5 years later in 2013, and the third and final reduction was proposed and scheduled for 2018. Now, one of the ways that this was achieved was through regionalization. So you notice on the upper right that most of the users subjected to these reductions were public water supplies. And so you see in the bottom kind of highlights some of the investments that were made by different water users in order to achieve these reductions. And we have at least 12 smaller towns and cities join forces to form the Neuse Regional Water and Sewer, which draws from the Neuse River in order to diversify their water sources and sort of achieve some of those reductions. And like in addition to theirs, there were many other municipalities that participated in regionalization efforts. And so this figure just sort of highlights the impact that had by, like, what I'm representing is the amount of water that was obtained through alternate sources and the rate at which those changes happened. So you see between 2010 and 2016, a major increase in diversification and development of alternative water sources from all of our users. Let's see, where do I want to wrap up here? Oh, there was, if you notice, like on my stair step on the upper left, like I have the proposed reductions, and then I have what we actually achieved, which is sort of the hashed line above that. And there's a little bit of a discrepancy there, and that can be explained by the issuance of temporary permits, which were implemented in 2014. Again, the program is, the CCPCOA program isn't there to stop people from using water. It is there to manage our water resources so that they are sustainable for the long run. And so the temporary permit grants an allowance for withdrawals above that proposed schedule, so long as there's evidence that those withdrawals are sustainable and there's no adverse impact on other users within the area. So we currently have 13 temporary permits. Basically, the rules on these, we consider them on a case-by-case basis upon request, and we look to see that their non-pumping or static water levels are either steady or trending upward. We ask that all of their pump intakes be above the tops of the aquifers, which physically prevents then dewatering. If you can't pump below the top of the aquifer, you can't dewater it. And as long as they're in compliance with the other rules of the permit, then we will consider those. And so as of today, we have achieved we're pumping, the withdrawals from those zone regions are 41% of what they were in 2007, which is a tremendous achievement through this program. Now, the rules were readopted in 2022 in light of those reductions, which were already achieved. There were some modifications to language, largely to remove proposed reductions into a definition, because we're no longer asking for additional reductions. And we will be up for readoption again, I believe, in 2032. Now, one of the requirements and one of the, I guess, great parts of this program is that all of our permittees and registered users report water data to us, which is a fantastic resource for us to continuously monitor our groundwater resources. And most of this is publicly available through our web interface, as well as different assessment reports that you can access. I'm not going to dwell on these a lot, but this is actually a really neat tool. You can view, query, you can pull up individual water user data, you look at historical withdrawals for an individual permittee, you can look at their sources, you can even pull up their individual water levels. And this is a great example because we see a beautiful trend going up, 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 which means that water levels are rebounding and or moving in the right direction. We have summary data that's available. You can take a snapshot year by year since the program has started. And to kind of wrap this up, I just wanted to show So this is a figure that illustrates where we have seen improvements in those most critically impacted zones in the Black Creek and the Upper Cape Fear aquifer. So blue basically means that we have filled in some of those deep depressions, and we're seeing water levels rebounding from that very vulnerable state that they were in 1997. But I do want to underscore that recovery does not mean sustainability, and that's why this program is important going forward, is because we continue to use the data that is supplied or reported by our permittees in order to monitor the state of the aquifer. And we do have our eyes on certain either persistent or new cones of depression that have popped up, particularly in the Castle Hayne, which is being used more as an alternate source in light to achieve some of those reductions. And so, these are where we have our eyes to the future, and there's a lot of discussions to be had about any additional changes that may be needed at the next readoption, but we think it's a great program to sustain our groundwater resources. And I think that's it.
Thank you so much, Dr. DeVries. That was a great presentation. We are bumping up against our allotted time, but if there are, maybe we can take 2 questions.
I've just got, I think, a quick one. You commented that the reductions don't imply or mean sustainability.
I mean that recovery, so recovering from where water levels were in 1997, so having seen water levels rise back up doesn't necessarily mean that that's permanent sustainability. We need to keep, because we do have new users coming in. And if we continue to add new users, eventually we can see that start to reverse. And there is going to be a point when, the water levels are going to stabilize or start to decline again. And we need to monitor the rate of those declines to make sure that it is at a manageable rate in order to not get us back in that same pickle that we were in 1997.
Okay. One more question? Yes, Commissioner.
Not a question so much as, as a comment. Especially in light of the earlier discussion of regionalization. I mean, this has been a hugely successful program, and it was really hard. I mean, the 2002 changes and moving toward mandatory reductions were really hard. And some small systems, as was mentioned, were told they had to reduce their withdrawals by as much as 75%. So part of what made it work, and this is just a shout out to then Division of Water Quality staff who worked with the North Carolina Rural Economic Development Center and some outside consultants to put together a study and a report that demonstrated how each of these affected communities could have an alternative water source, that nobody was going to be left with no water. There were alternatives. Here's what they were. And then following that up with funding and facilitating those projects. But that's a whole other universe of work that goes on outside just adopting the rules, and that's hugely important. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, we'll see if we have comments from Director Rogers.
I'll limit my comments. I do want to update the committee that the department and specifically our planning section is working with the legislature. They have a work group, IBT work group, that is moving forward and considering some legislation, hopefully to streamline the process and those kinds of things. So we continue to work with them. This started last year, and we do continue to work with them. And again, as Commissioner Smith indicated, the Central Coastal Plain Capacity Use Area is a great success, and it's amazing what we can do with a little information about water use. So just to leave that with you as well. But otherwise, those are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you. My comments are to the presenters. Thank you very much. All 3 of you, they were very informative, and I wish we'd had 2 hours today, but we didn't. So thank you, and our committee meeting stands adjourned.
And let me just announce, we're going to take a few minutes here as a break in between. We'll start, let's start the Air Quality Committee at 10:20.